All right, welcome back to Conspiranormal, and we are here, me and Robbie. As I said before, no Luke. And on the line we have Tracy Twyman, and Tracy has a book out called Clock Shavings, which is probably going to be one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. I actually heard an interview with you, Tracy, on the Higher Side chats quite a few months ago,
Hmm.
and I wanted to try to get you on then. And had some other kind of like work things come up, I think, for the both of us, and so finally have been able to get you on. But what I want to kind of do before we go into talk about clock shavings is to talk a little bit about kind of what your specialty is the whole, well, I guess the lack of a better term, the whole Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, I guess slash the Merovingian mythos, the Priory of Sion, and of course this is what kind of led you into the experiences that you had that you recount in Clock Shavings. So I want to kind of talk about uh, the mythology behind that and what the Priory of Sion is and what that's all about. I do have some questions for you about that as well.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't say that's my specialty per se anymore. It definitely was in the beginning. That is how I started my
Gotcha.
career as a esoteric, I guess. And I was about 18 years old when I started doing that. And
Wow.
that lasted for a long time because I started this magazine, Dagobah's Revenge. First started out as a kind of a joke, basically an art experiment, but then it turned into real journalism and real discoveries of esoteric secrets of history, and then it ended up lasting from 1996 to what was it, 2003 or 2004. So it was like 9 or 10 years of my life there that I spent writing about that stuff. Then, as you mentioned, I wrote the book, The Merovingian Mythos, which kind of summed up all the research I had done during those years. So definitely that was kind of my focus in the beginning. And when Da Vinci Code came out, which was around the time that Dagobah's Revenge was ending, um, it kind of overblew the whole subject. And by that time, I had my research, as I guess I'll explain in this interview, had basically broadened or gotten into, I guess, deeper subjects. So,
Gotcha.
since then I've been writing about other stuff. But yeah, I mean, well, go ahead and ask whatever questions you want to on that topic.
Well, the main question for me is, and it may be getting a little bit more into it than to talk about the basics. Is I always, I was into the whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing when I was growing up as like a teenager. I thought it was really interesting stuff. Later on, I came to find out that the Priory of Sion and the books that was described to me as being like a huge hoax that
Right.
some guys in France had pulled off in the 1950s. And I guess my main question is on that is if that's is that true? Was it a hoax or was it something deeper?
Well, I don't think that has ever really been proven.
Okay,
Partially because the whole thing has really been blown up by the people who wrote about it. So I can't say that 100% you could blame the characters who were involved in the Priory of Zion in the 1950s, which is for sure something that existed. I can't. I'm not sure if you can blame them for the way that their group was portrayed in uh, the writings of people that were writing nonfiction books about it and stuff at the time. So there was a guy named Gerard de Sade in France,
right.
like late 70s, wrote some books about it and really started to get the whole subject popular because he's the one who connected. He said that there was this group called the Priory of Zion. He had found their writings published, deposited in a library in France. And it was like, there was only that one copy there, but it was implied that it says on the front cover or the inside cover of these magazines that he found published by Priory of Zion, would say like how many copies there were supposedly in existence. So, you don't even know if there ever really was a circulation of these magazines or was there just this one deposited in the library or not. You don't know. But anyway, this guy wrote about what he found. He found these clues basically that seemed to have been left for someone to discover. in the library, and then those clues point to a mystery in southern France, in this village of Rennes-le-Château, where there's definitely in that village there's rumors about this priest that used to be in charge of the little church there in the village, and how he discovered some treasures, followed some mysterious clues he found in the church. Then he discovered a treasure, and no one knows what the treasure was, but somehow he got wealthy. And then he himself deposited his own clues for other people to find by redecorating the church. So this whole story really got put together by Gerard de Sade. He was following, to a certain extent, clues that he found, but I would say he was very influential in deciding how to interpret that information. And I guess you can say that the members of the Priory of Zion were guilty of playing up to that reputation that they were given. And so they never, when they would be interviewed by people who were writing about them, there was Gerard de Sade, and then later there were these English writers who wrote
Right.
Holy Blood, Holy Grail in the 80s. When these writers were writing about them, frequently in the interviews, Pierre Plantard was like one of the main spokesmen, who was supposedly the Grand Master. They would so often just say yes or no answers, or very cryptic answers, if any at all, to the questions that were posed. And the questions were always very leading questions. And the reason why is understandable, is because all the writers, had been doing what probably you and I did instinctively when we first started reading about it. You immediately, start thinking about how to put together all these mysterious clues. And so once you get your own theory going, you want to find out if you're right or not. So it's very easy to see how these writers came up with very interesting theories based on the clues they found. And then they interviewed the people from the Priory, and they weren't told anything that disproved their theories. In fact, they were given more clues that tantalized them and made them think, well, I'm really on the right track. So even though I guess there were 3 authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and that book got really popular in the 80s and really blew the subject up.
Extremely, yeah.
And 2 of them kind of went on to write about other things, but Henry Lincoln was the 3rd author, and he basically continued to write about the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, at least for the rest of his life. And go ahead.
I want to ask about Plantard, and I've heard that he was actually shocked when the Holy Blood, Holy Grail came out, because he had never said, well, we never said anything about being descendants of Jesus, right, or anything like that. Like, he just basically said that they had taken this story and just come up with some conclusion that really had nothing to do with anything that they were doing or trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I would say that was a bit of a leap that the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail really made, even more than Gerard de Sade. I don't think he was the one who would propose that at all. So, there were some clues indicating that, and definitely there is a hermetic tradition. And you can look at other books like Julius Egbola's Mystery of the Grail. I think that was written in the 40s or the 30s, something like that, earlier in the century. And he talks about how there's this tradition of the Grail family, and he ties it in to the idea of Jesus a little bit, the idea of Jesus having a family. So it's not unthinkable that they would have come to that conclusion, but there's definitely other ways to interpret it. And I would say for sure, Priory of Zion seems to me to be very similar to other tiny secret societies, tiny hermetic groups of people that do divination and magic together and study esoteric texts together. And I figure that that's what they were probably doing. Whether or not they were connected to the, in their writings, in their own magazines, they do sort of kind of claim that their organization is a continuation of an earlier organization started in the Middle Ages, and that that in itself was also connected to the Knights Templar. In fact, they say the Templars were, the military arm of their more powerful organization, Order of Sion, it was called at the time. It's pretty impossible to verify that. And even in their own publications, there were different versions of their ancestry. So but then again, that is all typical of secret societies, specifically Western occult societies. Almost all of them, somehow or another, try to tie their own the genealogy of their group to the Templars. They try to say that they're the continuation of the Templars. So
Somehow to make themselves bigger than they actually really are.
well, kind of. I mean, yeah. It's traditional to do that, I guess. But also, I don't necessarily think it's untrue to a certain extent, and here's why. And I guess this kind of gets into clock shavings, or the ideas behind it. Basically, I discovered by accident, through my own meddling with diabolic subjects, with divination and things like that, I discovered that you can contact beings from somewhere else. I mean, I don't know where they're from exactly, but they say they're from the abyss, or they might say they're from the heavens. You can contact beings from outside of this plane and talk to them. I did it on the Ouija board. There's other ways of doing it, and from what I can tell, this is the genesis of a lot of these secret societies. I mean, sure, you can, if you want to, form a club and call it a secret society and write your own rituals, and I guess it counts as a secret society. But which I tried to do that myself when we were doing Dagobah's Revenge. I created a secret society around the publication, involving the people that were involved in the magazine, and dedicated to the study of the subjects the magazine was about. But what happened when I made the contact with the beings from outside is everything just really got real all of a sudden, and I would say that's when my secret society became something else. It had a mind of its own almost. It definitely had a spiritual direction that was beyond me at that point.
That makes perfect sense.
So I think that, Priory of Zion could have been a product of that as well. Definitely the Templars were, because they said, their own confessions when they were arrested and tortured, they said, it was all about this being called Baphomet that they contacted and did rituals around, and it gave them wisdom, and that enabled them to become wealthy and to build the empire that they built. So I think that anyone who does that, anyone who can connect with the same intelligence that ran the Knights Templar, for instance, if you can do that, well, then you are continuing the tradition of the Templars. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong if the Priory of Zion wants to say that, or if the OTO wants to say that. And it's just you can say that sometimes the way that they portray that ancestry seems fictional, but really, how else? You can't just say to the profane audience, you just can't say it bluntly and go right out and say, hey, this information we're getting comes from beings that you can't see, and and that's the real reason why we're connected to the Templars. Instead, you have to do it in a different way. And
it's more of a I'm sorry. It's more of a spiritual pedigree than it is maybe a genetic one.
Yeah,
or a historical one. Yeah,
it's not necessarily wrong to tell fables when you're describing sacred things, or things that are too hard to comprehend, or also things that just the mass of people won't comprehend, things that only initiated people will comprehend. It's traditional, really, to put it in the form of a story or a parable that has a metaphor to it that maybe not everyone will get at first, but that's really the only way you can say certain things. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily apologizing for the Priory of Zion. They might be shysters. I don't know, but I'm saying that you can see how it happened that way. They're a secret society. This is the way that secret societies tend to operate. And then they had a journalist come along who just bought everything they were saying at face value, and then also went beyond that and interpreted things that weren't even necessarily there, and they just played up to it because they had a international audience all of a sudden. And and there is interesting things about the members of the Priory, the ones that were running around being interviewed, and were friends with the people that were being interviewed for those books, the Holy Blood, Holy Grail books. A lot of those people really do have interesting backgrounds, and you can connect them to people involved in intelligence and people involved in royal families that are connected to the Merovingian, the Grail bloodline that those authors were writing about. So even if it's a hoax, or I don't know, so that, even if they were toying with the audience a little bit.
There were some links, I believe, between Plantard and his little circle, and I think like the P2 mafia in Italy.
For sure.
He was involved, I think, he was part of the French Resistance, I believe, in World War II, and had some kind of quasi-fascist overtones to some of his work.
Mm-hmm. And then there's groups like there's this thing called Rectified Scottish Rite. It seems to be a form of Martinism. Both of those things also are quasi-Masonic groups that are all centered in Western Europe, particularly France. So, and when you look up some of the other names, okay, there was this movie I was in, Bloodline, and they interviewed this guy called Nick Haywood, who claimed to be part of the Priory. And they also interviewed this guy named Gino Sandri, a Frenchman, who said he was part of the Priory. And Gino Sandri can be connected to all of the same characters that were being interviewed for Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So he's really definitely part of the same milieu as those guys. And when you look up his name and really do deep searching to try to figure out who he is and any trace of what he's done in the past, you find that he's co-author to a bunch of Hermetic books published by very obscure Masonic lodges and also a Martinist lodge. And that he's also an artist. And several of the characters involved with the Priory of Zion, the ones that were being interviewed for Holy Blood, Holy Grail, several of those guys were artists also, and particularly involved in sort of modern, surrealist, Dadaist kind of art. And there's even a tradition amongst those types in France. There, a sort of a surrealist French artist of creating hoaxes, writing cryptic things and doing cryptic art and trying to make it mysterious and publishing it and trying to get people to read into it and try to get people involved in decrypting whatever your artwork is, and you don't even necessarily tell people that it's a work of art, or that it's not necessarily a joke either. It's like there could be something ritualistic to this. In other words, if they're purposely putting out false or misleading information in a cryptic way, putting out clues for people to follow, it could be both an art project and also a ritual.
Kind of reminds me of the Discordian Society a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. And so we don't necessarily know what the goal is, and maybe we'll never know, because it also could be just between them and their outer head, between them and their spiritual mentors, the beings that they're in contact with. Maybe they were instructed to create certain images and say certain phrases. You may never know why. It's all part of the ritual, and maybe they don't even know why. So that's the kind of stuff I can see possibly going on here with the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau and all the clues put out by the Priory of Zion. And I never would have thought that. Of course, I myself was a very serious researcher of this subject and didn't take that approach to researching it until the very end, after I had experienced it myself, after I had made contact with beings from outside and had them give me instructions about what I should publish. And there were times when I didn't even understand the meaning of it. I was given specific words and phrases to use, and I didn't even know why. And sometimes I would do that, and it would seem to have a particular magical effect. Go ahead.
Well, let's get into that. Let's get into basically the what is in clock shavings.
Okay.
This contact with otherworldly entities through the Ouija board.
Yeah.
You had set out to originally I believe, to contact, and I might totally just screw the French here, but Jean Cocteau.
Right. Okay, yeah, he's one
Uh,
of these artists. He was a member of the Priory of Zion, supposedly,
right.
and had actually lived right before this time period when these materials were being published. In fact, he was still alive until '63, so he could have totally
Yeah.
been involved with the publishing of those magazines that I talked about. And yeah, so we were trying to contact him, and that's how this whole thing got started. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry. Go ahead.
What was the purpose of contact? Why specifically him? Did you want to contact? Was you just feel like he had passed away relatively recently, and maybe you were able to would have been able to contact him?
No,
Was
it
it
was
just more like a lark that you guys maybe just thought, this will be fun to do? Or
well, it was a lark in a way, but basically, I had just moved to Denver, where one of my writing partners was living at the time, and I actually met up with my other research partner, Brian, the guy who I ended up marrying. He had been living in Portland. We had like gone to school together, and then I moved away, but we all met together in Denver finally that year, which was 2001. And
gotcha.
so I moved in with Brian. He was my roommate. Down the street was this other writer we were working with. And that at that particular time, we were preparing a whole issue of articles for Dagobert's Revenge magazine that were going to be about Jean Cocteau, because I had been researching a lot of his paintings, his poems, and his films in particular. And I saw things that indicated that maybe he was part of the Priory of Zion and that it was real. The claim was real. And in fact, that maybe, he was putting out cryptic clues himself in his own artwork and writing. So, I wanted to find out more about that. And when I read his biography, one of the things it said was that he had been involved with a circle of people, including Victor Hugo and I think her name was Jean Hugo, his wife, and some other artists and writers. They would have seances. They would do what was called table rapping back then, because the commercially produced Ouija board hadn't been made yet. And
Yeah.
so people were doing table rapping, which is kind of, you're listening for knocks on a table, literally, and however many knocks there are, that tells you what letter of the alphabet to use.
Kind of the era of spiritualism.
Yeah, and it was, a much more long, drawn out, and painful process to divine a message than the Ouija board. But anyway, people did that back then, and Cocteau was way into it, and received some very, I guess, impactful messages that really moved him, and he thought it was real. The communication was real, and in fact, once you realize that, you start looking at his paintings and especially his films, like Testament of Orpheus, especially, which is what he did. The film he made, I think, the year he died, or right before the year he died, which was like a retrospective on his life, and it was sort of saying goodbye to everyone because he could tell he was about to die, I think. And so when you look at that film, it too is about communication from beyond, and even the film that it's kind of based on, which is Orpheus, he made earlier in his life, which is based on the myth of Orpheus. Well, that's about journeying to the underworld, because the main character's wife dies, and so he actually has to go to the underworld to try to get her back from death. And the way that it all starts off with the guy. The character in the movie is a poet, which, as I said, Jean Cocteau himself is also a poet. That's what he considered to be his main talent. And so in the movie Orpheus, the poet is actually getting his inspiration from this radio. He's able to tune into a particular station on his radio, and the station is broadcasting all of these strange messages. He doesn't know what they mean, but they're poetic, he thinks. So he writes them down and publishes them and becomes famous because of it. Well, the messages, it turns out, are actually coming from Hades. They're coming from the underworld. So, that really is a clue.
Interesting.
Where he was getting his inspiration from. And so all this moved me, after I just moved in with my writing, or one of my research partners, Brian. We were unpacking our stuff, and he pulled out a Ouija board from one of his boxes. And
Okay.
so we decided, sorry, it's a long story, but basically this is
No, it's
how
all
it
right. Yeah.
started. And so, we started that night and immediately got what I would say is a response. It didn't take even a second. We put a little glass bottle on top of this board, and it started moving in a way that I could tell I was not moving it and he wasn't moving it. It was something else coming through. And even though the messages in the beginning weren't very useful, I was just impressed that it was working at all. And he definitely was. He was telling us something. He just wasn't able to speak English very well. So it took a few tries actually to get anything at all out of it. It's all in the book. I write down what some of the messages were that did come through, and one of it was, "I am blocked for you," and he was saying, "I'm having a hard time talking." And
Hmm.
eventually, we did sessions over several different nights, and eventually, he was able to tell us that we need to talk to someone else. And so, who he told us to talk to was Cain, or he also called him the Black Sun. And it turned out this is a subject or a figure that we had been researching a bit anyway, and we thought that he was tied into the subject of the Grail and the Grail bloodline. So we did, in fact, then go talk to Cain, and by that I do mean the villain of the Bible.
Right, the biblical Cain, the one that slew Abel. How was he? Now, I've heard, kind of in the kind of versed into like the Christian world, kind of like fringe evangelical Christian world, and there is this idea in that world, and I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with it, but the idea of the serpent seed theory.
Right.
And so I found it interesting in your book that it was basically supporting that theory somewhat. We've actually had Scotty Roberts on, and he's talked about that in one of our interviews with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how does that fit into the Grail? Did you see that he would be like the beginning of the Grail lineage?
Yeah, that is what I would say. And I started off looking at that angle mainly because of the writings of L.A. Waddell, who's this old Sumeriologist and Orientalist, as they called it back then. He was writing around the 1920s when the finds from Mesopotamia were first coming out, and they were first finding, for instance, evidence of, the writings and civilization of Sumeria. And so, granted, he was writing when academia hadn't had a lot of time to really take that information in and study it. So he was studying fresh information and forming his own theories about it. He was one of these guys that likes to put everything together. And he also thinks that that there was a greater civilization in the past that the evidence has been forgotten, but he was one of these guys that thinks that there was this great race of conquerors and civilizers, and he called them Aryans.
Like in Atlantis almost.
Yeah, and they went around sort of invading and conquering and then civilizing all of this, I guess, more primitive peoples, and created a giant empire. And he takes in the kings list for the Sumerians, which of course goes back thousands of years, and so the kings themselves would reign for thousands of years, supposedly.
Yeah, that stuff's crazy. It's like 36,000 years for a reign of one king.
Right. So he was doing a lot of what Zacharias Sitchin was writing about, really, but he wasn't theorizing about rocket ships or anything like that. He was just
Yeah,
saying that
I
all
gotcha.
these stories about these from these ancient civilizations and their what they say were their first kings, and a lot of times they say basically they're gods, and gods came down, first ruled them directly, and then eventually they bred with humans and created a race of demigods, and those became the first human kings. And that's how the beginning is with so many of these civilizations. So you find the same thing in, Egypt and Sumer, and a lot of these the Indian stories as well. So yeah. Anyway, L.A.
Genesis
Waddell.
chapter 6.
Exactly. Oh, okay. So L.A. Waddell talks about that a little bit, but he wasn't trying to get too supernatural, I think. So
Gotcha.
The way he was viewing it, he was saying, "Oh, these stories in the Bible are just another version of this ancient history that has been forgotten." And so he viewed it as these were some really advanced people who were viewed as gods or angels, by less advanced people. Well, so anyway, but one of the first kings or most important kings, he thinks is Cain. So the figure that's identified as Cain in the Bible is actually matching up with this figure that you can find in the kings lists of these ancient civilizations, and where he's described as Khan or Kin. And Waddell went to a great deal of trouble to try to connect at least the first few of these kings to the biblical patriarchs, and also to all the gods or demigods of all these ancient cultures. He came up with his own chronology, where he sort of rewrites history in a way that he thinks makes sense. But what I found was intriguing. I didn't necessarily believe everything Waddell was saying, but I think he's kind of going down the right path here. And the figure of Cain, it really struck me as important. And if I could find out more about him, he might actually be the origin of this Grail bloodline. Because I could tell from researching the clues of that the Priory of Zion had left, and also the Grail stories themselves, the Grail romances, where they do talk about a Grail bloodline again. I could tell that the whole theory of this being started with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that just wasn't it. That they may be involved, it's possible. They may be part of the bloodline. But I really felt like the myths surrounding the Merovingians, for instance, that pointed to something else, that it was really similar to these more ancient stories about the origins of human kings, where they said that the human kings came from gods or angels breeding with humans. And in fact, the story of how the Merovingian bloodline started is that supposedly the progenitor of the bloodline was the result of a fusion of human blood with that of some inhuman creature called a Kinotaur.
Right.
So
something from the ocean or something like that.
Yeah, a sea creature, a sea bull. So I just thought that it was a clue. Of course, the people who wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail thought, oh, that means fish and that means Jesus. But I think that's not it. I think it's really about this bloodline that can be traced back to these ancient gods or angels, and a lot of times the ancient gods would themselves be depicted as fish. So the Sumerians, for instance, would depict, they had fish gods or gods that were associated with the ocean and water, and there were rituals of baptism, and the priests would be wearing these. Basically, it looks like they gutted a fish and put it on top of their head, and the tail is going down their back, and that's like their ritual garb that the priests would wear when they're servicing the gods. And the mouth of the fish would be on top of their head. So There's a theory, actually, that a lot of the Christian rituals come from this, and that's why the Pope's hat looks the way it is because it really comes from this ancient fish head that priests used to wear, and that's why we do baptism, is because they did. So
interesting.
Anyway, I felt like, well, this is probably what these myths are about, that the French stories of the Grail and even these modern esoteric societies like the Priory of Zion, what mysteries are they really celebrating but the origin of royal bloodlines with whatever these gods are? And I think that's, I still think that's true. So I was researching with that sort of assumption in my mind. And Cain seemed like he was a very central figure. In fact, Waddell himself and several other writers I found had said that Cain's name is connected to the origin of the word king. And and then there's this other thing, which I don't even know if I knew back then, but I found out that a lot of the European witches, particularly witchcraft covens that involved people from witch families, because there would, for generations sometimes in Western Europe and England, there would be families of witches. There still are people who claim to be of families of witches, and they say that their powers of witchcraft come from their blood. And they would say that they all share an ancestry going back to Cain. And then they have these stories, myths, that match up with actually Kabbalistic stories about Cain and Lilith, a demon from the Judeo-Christian tradition, that they, had children that were sort of quasi-demonic human beings, and that all the real witches, all the witches by blood, are actually the children of these beings. So anyway, yeah, it seemed to me like Cain was an important figure, and in fact, so we contacted Cain on the Ouija board, and that is when we really started to get some powerful messages, I would say. I told you that Jean Cocteau had a hard time talking, and Cain didn't have a hard time talking at all. So,
yeah, no problem for him. Yeah.
So, yeah, he started telling us all sorts of stuff, actually, about ancient history and about these myths and stories from the Bible and from other cultures. So, yeah, go ahead. I mean... surely you have
Sorry. What did he tell you about ancient cultures, and also too, as you relate in the book, this kind of relationship between not just Cain and Abel, but also Cain as opposed to Adam and Eve, and the third son, which is Seth,
mm-hmm.
And also and it gets real complicated at one point that there's a possibility that we may actually be dealing with the same bloodline or two different bloodlines because there's so many different similar sounding names.
Yeah, and I don't really even still know what the truth of that is, but I went through several different theories as I was researching it. So, first of all, I would say one of the most interesting things he told us was about the Garden of Eden itself and how it ended. So, he told us basically this epic story. It felt like we were just downloading like the Odyssey or something.
We could Lord of the Rings or something. Yeah.
Exactly. It was very much like Lord of the Rings. We could build a whole religion around just this one Ouija board session with all the stuff he told us. So he said that Garden of Eden was actually, the home seat of this empire, similar to what L.A. Waddell described. Cain was saying it's the same as Atlantis. So, like a lot of the people that used to write books about Atlantis, they would say, Atlantis was an island populated by children of the gods, children of Poseidon, who were the rulers, and then they had this very advanced society, and they also conquered the people around them, and there was this vast empire. Well, he was saying Garden of Eden is the same thing, or Eden, and that at Eden there was a throne that was the seat of power for that whole empire. The throne itself, he actually described as being connected to this thing called the Ark, which eventually got described as being sort of the vessel that holds the sacred power, whatever that is. But it's the power that, gives them their right to rule, I guess. Whoever has the Ark, he described, whoever has the Ark has the power and the right to rule. And he also described it as the one box of things. And eventually I came to interpret that as it's, whatever's inside of it is kind of like the Philosopher's Stone.
Right.
It has this transformative magical power. You can make whatever you want to happen, basically, once you have control of whatever that is. So he says
the Holy Grail itself, right? I mean,
Yes, exactly. He said it was the same thing. So, he tells us this story about how I guess he was saying that his own children were the rulers of some of these outlying nations, that were part of the empire, and that they eventually rebelled against his rule, and they were trying to get the Ark, and they wanted to take control over the whole empire for themselves. And so he described how there was this huge war about that, and that is what caused the sinking of Atlantis. That's what caused the fall from the garden, and that's why you can't see the garden anymore, because the garden actually, or at least a large portion of Eden, collapsed. He actually described it as going under the waves. And he identified certain land masses that got subsumed underneath waves. And he said how that happened. Okay, first he says that there was this war fought with swords and axes, and lots of just bloodshed and people killing each other. And then eventually he became so angry about the whole thing that he did a magic ritual or some sort of alchemical ritual. He called it the Wrath of Cain, and said that he caused this flood to happen and the fall of Eden, or the fall of Atlantis, as we were describing it. And then he, sort of got into the topic of the Ark of Noah, and I assume it is connected to the other ark he was talking about, this throne or this box of power, whatever it was. I think that's somehow connected to the Ark of Noah too. There's in some way the same thing. So, and he talks about how he tried to save Eve. He's, I guess, he literally tried to keep her alive. Oh, he talked about he used the term live water. And then he said Adam's body was on board the ark, his dead body, which, as I researched later, there's a tradition about that. Go ahead.
That's so interesting. I'd never run across that before, ever, until I read your book.
And then, a lot of the things that he told me back then, I didn't even understand them very well until I wrote Clock Shavings, because you can sort of tell how it came together, too, as you read it. I think you can tell. Like, I wrote down what happened, the narrative of the story, as well as I could remember it, and I would explain things as I felt that I needed to make the readers understand. So there's little parts where there's kind of an essay that tells you the meaning of things, but mostly it's a story, a narrative. But then the final chapter, which is about it's over 100 pages long. I know that it's like a third of the book, is my summation of things from my perspective today. And a lot of these things I hadn't really thought about in 10 years or so. And I went back through my transcripts of all these Ouija board sessions, and that's when a lot of my understanding came. So the story about the fall of Eden, really, I didn't understand it. And I wouldn't claim that I fully understand it now. It's one of those mysteries. Probably no one ever will. But my perspective on it now is just so much deeper. So the whole thing makes a lot more sense, because really there are a lot of traditions about the fall of Eden, and that almost all of it was destroyed except for what they call the supernal Eden. The Golden Dawn has this whole tradition about the supernal Eden, and how basically there in Eden there's this tree that the tree of life. It has this fruit, and somehow the fruit enables people to live forever. And the whole story that you find in the Bible really says this. It says that after Adam and Eve ate the fruit of knowledge, God or the gods, because it shows God talking to someone, whoever those beings were. And God is saying to whoever that, oh no, now they've eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and the next thing you know, they're going to eat from the tree of life too, and they'll be able to live forever, and then nothing will be impossible for them. And he finds this threatening, and so in order to prevent that from happening, he creates whatever this is, something called the flaming sword. And it says that it turns every way around the tree of life. So I kind of imagined it as like a laser beam or something surrounding the tree of life, and it would cut you in half if you tried to reach across it. So it could be that, I don't know, but it seems like it's some kind of impenetrable chasm or force field that protects this object, whatever it is, the tree of life, that actually gives people the ability to live forever. Well, it turns out there's lots of traditions about this very thing, and so I went through a lot of them in the final chapter of the book. And it seems like I guess my point is just that there really is this supposed throne of Eden. There's this treasure that is very empowering if you can have it. It'll even give you eternal life, but it's been barred from us. It's been hidden from us, so we can't see it. And it's also been hidden from Cain and all of his cohorts, because Cain told us that he was speaking to us from the center of the earth and the underworld, and so he was really in hell, basically. But he didn't describe himself at the time as being tortured. It was more like he said he was in a death-like sleep. He was kind of in a coffin, and he was sort of speaking to us in his dreams. And in fact, I did some research subsequently, recently, in fact, and found out that there's lots of myths about gods like that. Like there's a story about Kronos or Saturn, that he's asleep on an island and he's talking to people through his dreams, and he's there being punished by Zeus.
So many similar things across so many different mythologies and so many different cultures.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Especially like a lot of the Old Testament stories, they seem to kind of pop up all over, like, every other advanced ancient culture that we know about.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, the fact that I can, 10 years later go back and look at these things that I totally forgot about, there's just so many details that I forgot about until I looked at the transcripts again. The fact that I can go back and look at it again and find all of these correlations that I didn't even know about at the time, just again says to me, well, this was a very real contact that I made with something, and it gave me some very real information, and real in the sense that it's something to work with. Now, I've gotten, since I published this book and started doing interviews, sometimes I get these interviews that are really painful to conduct, because people just want to keep drilling me about talking to what they consider demons. In fact, later I definitely was talking to demons. And they're just like, well, you can't believe what they say, and that may be true, but they're giving me something to work with here. And also, I think that my contact with these beings is basically about as genuine as anyone has ever had. In other words, what I made a joke earlier and said you could build a religion off of the information I got. Well, you really could, and in fact, there's religions that are built off of much less. And so I think that now I have no desire to do such a thing, but the stuff that I've got here is some really good stuff, I think, is what my point, I guess.
Well, Cain puts you in touch. Well, I believe that he only takes you in your line of questioning so far, and he puts you in touch with another entity.
That's right.
And that entity we've already kind of mentioned is Baphomet.
Yes, and that all started. The conversation where we got referred to Baphomet had to do with Brian and I felt like we were cursed because we were having problems with money that seemed weird, just like more than what the average person would have to face. And like things would just keep going wrong for us. We would have things lined up, and then something would, the rug would be pulled out from under us all of a sudden. And so we just got to feeling like, well, there's something metaphysical about this. And hey, we know how to talk to spirits, so why don't we just find out if they can see anything that we can't see from our own perspective? And so we asked Cain if we were cursed, and sure enough, he says that we are. We asked, well, who cursed us? I'm thinking, one of these jerks on the internet that hates me. Maybe they did a magic ritual to curse me. But he says, no, it was Baphomet, at which I jumped out of my skin. I was like, what do you mean by that? Because I had heard the name, of course. I knew that the Templars, were associated with this being called Baphomet. I knew it was they used this idol of a head or a skull. That was their contact point that they used to contact Baphomet and do rituals to him. And I knew that Eliphas Levi had, who was an occultist in the 1800s, he had written a book and published an image of Baphomet,
which has become the famous image now, I think.
Right. And so that shows him as actually a hermaphroditic human with a goat head. So these things I sort of knew, and I'd written about a little bit, but really hadn't thought much about Baphomet. He wasn't on my mind at all. So it was a surprise.
Wasn't that what Marilyn Manson was trying to do in the late 90s?
Be a hermaphrodite with a goat head, maybe.
Yeah. Well, he had that time where he had fake breasts or something. So that did make me think of Baphomet a little bit.
Well, yeah, Marilyn Manson was in the Church of Satan, and
Yeah.
the Church of Satan sort of revived the subject of Baphomet, but they prefer to use the name Satan. So they mention Baphomet, and they use the sigil of Baphomet with a goat's head, but most of their rituals just use the word Satan. And I'm not, and most people conflate the two, and I don't think they're wrong necessarily. It's just I see Baphomet as sort of a particular intelligence, more specific than Satan. But anyways,
Right.
so Baphomet, I find out that he or it has cursed us, and so we just got right to the point and called up Baphomet on the boards to find out, hey, what's the problem here, dude?
Nothing ever started smoking or any portals started opening up when you did this. I mean, it was just things are pretty normal all throughout.
Other than some candles flickering and maybe a sensation down your spine every now and then, we didn't get any physical manifestations. But then again, we weren't asking for it. There was
No gateways to hell or anything to open up for.
So how do you approach questioning an ancient demonic presence and asking
Yeah.
it if it cursed you? Like,
it's all on video, actually. If you go to YouTube, our first conversation with Baphomet, I believe, is up there already. So you can see how
Okay.
how it happened. And we were
Wow.
just straightforward with it, I just talk to these beings normally with the assumption that they have enough perspective from where they are to be able to interpret to some extent the words that I'm saying. So I just spoke to them normally. I said, "Hi, who are you?" And we've heard that you've cursed us. Is that true? And so, yeah, then we got some information. Why? Oh, yeah, that's right. Baphomet said he'd cursed us because I had promised another author, a guy named Nicholas DeVere. I had promised him that I would help him publish one of his books. And then I forgot about it or didn't care that much. And so I put it on the back burner, was busy with other things. And Baphomet comes and says to us that's the problem. You need to publish DeVere's book. Actually, first thing he said was, you need to publish a book. And I'm like, what book? Because I was working on 3 different books at the time. And he's DeVere's book. And I thought, why do I have to publish someone else's book? What about mine? But no, that was what it was. He cared so much about this book and was angry with me that I hadn't put it out yet. And from what I could tell from what he was saying, it sounded like, well, maybe he had orchestrated the whole thing. Maybe he had put me in touch with DeVere, and maybe, that's what he'd been pushing me to do all along. And so, I took this seriously, and I did actually publish or help DeVere publish his book to try to alleviate this curse. And also, the funny thing was, when I told Nick, the author, about this conversation, he didn't seem all that surprised. That's another conversation, I suppose. But Nicholas DeVere, I think, was also connected to Baphomet and was writing he was writing a whole book about this bloodline. And he was writing from the perspective of someone who's a member of these witchcraft families I was describing. So, Baphomet cared about that work. He cared about it a lot and really wanted it published. So that put us in contact with Baphomet. And at that point, I would say our research and understanding of the esoteric topics we were looking into expanded even greater. At that point, I really felt like I was in an esoteric school where the teacher was a spirit. And it was really cool because it was like joining, one of the highest secret societies without having to be invited by a human. That my initiation was when I spoke to Baphomet on the Ouija board. That's what sparked the whole thing. And from that point on, my education in the whole subject, I would say, just really took a quantum leap. And so that's why I would honestly say that's why I'm no longer, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the Grail subject and that's what I do. I would say that I have a much broader perspective now because everything just took off at that point. And so now I compare it in the book to, in Clock Shavings, I mention this concept of the Sholomance, which comes from Bram Stoker's novel about Dracula. And in that novel, he says that, Dracula runs this school where actually the headmaster is really the devil himself. and 13 pupils are invited every year to come, and only one of them graduates. And when you graduate, you get to, quote, ride the dragon. And then you yourself become like a permanent fixture in the school. And so I felt like that's what it was in a way. You know, I had joined the Sholomance. I was being instructed directly by, you know, someone that some people call the devil. But at that, you know, funnily enough, at the time, I didn't feel like he was the devil. You know, sometimes I understood, you know, the darkness, I guess, that surrounded Baphomet, but I was coming at it from, I guess, a different perspective. So, because Baphomet, in a way, you know, yes, he's the devil, but he's like the alchemical devil. He's he represents this force that's kind of beyond everything. You know, it's transcendent. So he is a hermaphrodite, and I just say he is just a, you know, an easier way of speaking. He's not a he. In fact, when Cain talked about Baphomet on the board, Cain referred to it as a she.
Yeah.
So, but I just say he, just, you know, so that I don't have to think about it too hard when I'm talking.
Well, with a name like Baphomet, I mean, it'd be hard to kind of not refer to him as a he. It's a very masculine sounding name.
I guess, but probably in the French it did, because it was Baphomet, I think.
Baphomet. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
Isn't there a link to the whole concept of Baphomet to it being almost like a mistranslation of the word Sophia?
Well, not a mistranslation. It's like some people have had the theory that it was a cipher, you know, a cryptic way of saying Sophia.
Right.
So, well, and I think that there may be something to that, because the cipher that has been used to turn the word Baphomet into Sophia, the one that's being theorized about by people who write about that subject, is called the Atbash cipher. And yeah. I only found out about it accidentally, what Atbash cipher really is. I had read that word, but I didn't know what it was. Well, it turns out, okay, Cain, in my dealings with Cain, before he even referred us to Baphomet, he started doing this thing where he would visit every single letter on the board by going from A to Z and then B to Y, and he would go from N to N like that until he'd worked his way to the middle. So inverting the alphabet, really. And and we thought there was some sort of meaning to this. We threw all sorts of theories at him to try to tease out the meaning of it. And you know, we just thought it was a mystical idea that he was teaching us about transcendentalism and transcending duality, and I don't know. It was some sort of alchemical secret, we thought. And we even took my husband became my husband, Brian, on inspiration one night. He redesigned our whole Ouija board. And, you know, originally we had a Parker Brothers board. And one night I wake up in the middle of the night to find him on the computer, and he's designing a new Ouija board. And it had all sorts of new symbols on it, interesting things. All of it derived from the conversations we'd had with Cain and Baphomet. And when he came to the alphabet, he actually put it in a wheel in a circle and arranged it so that it was just like this this alphabet inversion that I had just described. So Z was on the opposite side of the wheel to A. And so, sorry, I had to check on my son there. I think he just woke up. Anyway, so it turns out this arrangement of the alphabet is the Atbash cipher. And I only found that out like a year after he had designed the Ouija board. So Cain and Baphomet were both giving us the Atbash cipher, and we didn't know it. And that, yeah, that is how you turn the word Baphomet into Sophia, which means divine wisdom.
Yeah.
And other interesting things connected to Baphomet and Sophia. Okay, one of the things we asked Baphomet is, you know, are you a head, or, you know, we asked, what is Baphomet? He said head. And so we said, okay, so you really are this skull that was worshipped by the Templars. He says, yes. Which skull? John. And that's what he said. John. And so it's the skull of John the Baptist, which is one of the theories that's been around, that the Templars actually had John the Baptist's head, and they used it to
Right.
as a ritual device to contact Baphomet. And then so we ask, well, where is the head now? And he said, Istanbul. And again, of course, we didn't know it at the time. Years later, I researched the thing, and turns out that there is a skull of John that's on display even now in the, how do you pronounce this? I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's the Church of the Sophia, the Divine Wisdom Church that's in Istanbul.
Yeah, the Hagia Sophia.
Yeah, but you're not supposed to pronounce the H, and I can't remember how exactly you're supposed to say it. Anyway, so this church is amazing. Even now, it's beautiful, but it's apparently been rebuilt. The first version of it got sacked amazingly by Christian crusaders.
Right.
So there's I subsequently wrote a book called Solomon's Treasure, which was mainly about the esoteric history of money. And in that book, I talked a lot about Baphomet because I felt like Baphomet had been a big influence on the history of money. The whole thing started with the Templars inventing a credit system, the first credit system, really, the first international credit system that was used by pilgrims who were visiting the Holy Land. And, really, historically, this is how banking started. Everyone kind of traces it back to the Templars, and this is how they were able to build such a huge empire. This is really how they became wealthy. And so, if you think about it, they say that it was Baphomet that taught them wisdom and enabled them to become wealthy. Well, maybe somehow he taught them this whole secret of banking, which, as I described in Solomon's Treasure, is like alchemy, and it's a confidence trick. Really, it's a magical act, really, because it's about using magical symbols, which are on all of the money, and using the faith that people have in their government to transform something that on its face has no value into something that does have value and represents value and can be used to trade value. And then you can loan it out and actually create value out of nothing by getting paid back for that and getting paid back with interest.
Definitely a magical working there for sure.
Yeah, and there's more aspects too. There's more
Right.
Alchemical tricks you can do with the money, as I describe in the book. But so I think that Baphomet, might have been the inspiration for that. Also, in that book, I talk about the history of Constantinople a little bit, and Istanbul, and the Church of Sophia, because I kind of thought, as I was going through the history of money, I also noticed how certain places would become the sort of economic center of the world as history moves on. It's almost like the ring of power gets moved from one place to another, and that place becomes the economic center. And so for a while, Byzantium was really where it was at in the world, and
Yes.
or Constantinople was the center of it. So I feel like at one point it was like the Grail was there, basically. That was my theory. It's like there's this thing, this power that enables civilizations to rise, and when it leaves them, they fall. And that the Templars may have at some point been able to hold that power through their contact with Baphomet. And so that since then, other groups and other people have been able to contact and utilize that power via the, Baphomet as a intermediary, I guess. And so I think that's kind of why Baphomet is portrayed as being this transcendental power. It's all in the way that Eliphas Levi describes the concept of Baphomet. It's like this is the transcendental power of alchemy. Baphomet is the embodiment of it. So he is the thing that changes something during a magic ritual. And
I want to ask Tracy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not to get too much sidetracked on this, but the Knights. It's generally said that the Freemasons are the successors to the Knights Templar.
Yes.
And if that's true, then is it possible that these groups, these secret societies that are out there now, that they have this power that they do because of that link? to Baphomet?
Yeah, I would say so. That's how the Freemasons that were involved and integral in starting, what eventually became the United States. I would say that they were utilizing that power and utilizing the inspiration that came to them from that entity. And then I would say that now I don't think it's the Freemasons anymore, or it may be a group or an organization that's based on a similar kind of framework and is maybe carrying, has hold of the power now, this ring of power that we're talking about, the Grail. But I don't think the word Freemason necessarily applies anymore. Or maybe I'm saying that just because there's so many Masonic lodges and so many different groups, and surely the majority of them aren't anywhere close to the Ring of Power, I
would agree with you on that. Yeah.
So it's not. Who these people are really now who are in control of things, I think it's still a mystery. I don't think anyone knows. I haven't heard anything convincing. I think that some of the characters that get described in conspiracy literature are probably close to it, or they're playing a role. But it's really hard to tell who has it now. So, and I know that sounds like kind of a cop-out, but basically what I'm saying is I think the international finance now, it's very difficult to say who's in control, because it used to be that there was this global order that centered around the U.S. dollar. And as I described in Solomon's Treasure, I think that was all inspired by, originally Freemasons working with Baphometic currents, and then that system that they built. I don't think that the founding fathers envisioned or wanted necessarily to create the Federal Reserve System, but I think that the Federal Reserve System was eventually created by people who understood these principles of alchemy, and they were using the framework I would say, I guess what I'm saying is the United States government, the way it what it evolved into became the right vessel for them to use to use alchemical secrets to then expand the power of the United States throughout the world with the U.S. dollar. Now, these days, it's clear to me that is changing. It may not be through changing yet. It's still in the process, and we don't know what it's changing into. But that system is coming apart. It's ending. And, right now you've got other world powers trying to fill that vacuum. You've got Russia trying to form alliances with China and Iran and other groups to just create another system of international finance. And I don't know what's going to come of that. I mean, it seems every year we're more and more looming on the edge of some sort of vast international conflict, another world war, perhaps. And that may be what has to happen for us to see what the next stage is. And maybe only after the next world war will we really see where the Ring of Power has moved to.
And actually, along those same lines, it's a really nice segue to what I was going to ask you next, which is what did Baphomet, that there was some communication from Baphomet, and you actually had Satan, you were talking to Satan on the Ouija board as well. Yeah. And there was some talk about the end of days.
Oh, yeah, quite a lot.
And this is some of the scarier stuff in the book.
Exactly, yes. I would say even now it scares me, and even now we're still getting messages about it, because...
Really?
In the book I kind of talk about how we closed down the Ordo Lapsit Exulis, which was our secret society. But and then I didn't do a lot of divination for a few years, but I have resumed it, and it really kind of continued without a hitch. We were able to pick up the same conversations with the same entities without any trouble. And by we, I mean I'm even working with different people, and I've even sometimes had sessions where I had other people on the board that were not that didn't know the history at all. They didn't know any of the terminology or any of the conversations we've had in the past. I'm standing in the room, but not with my hands not on the board. Other people are operating it. I can question the entity, and I'll get an answer that uses code words, like things that the people operating the board wouldn't know. So obviously the spirit, is still there, still talking to us, and we'll use the hands of whoever I choose to be on the board. And so even recently, we've been getting messages about the end of days. In fact, I did some of this stuff live on international or national radio on the Clyde Lewis show on Halloween. And talked about,
Wow.
Talked about this idea that there are poles holding up the heavens, which is basically an archetype that you find in every ancient culture. That there are poles that hold up the worlds, and a mountain is often the symbol of the pole. So, the mountain's peak reaches high up into heaven, and the mountain itself is holding up the heavens, separating it from earth, which is necessary. Life could not continue if the heavens were not being separated from earth constantly. And, also it says that usually the way these myths go is that the underworld is accessed by caves that are inside of this mountain. So it's this axis that's running through heaven, earth, and hell. And the mountain is holding up the heavens, or holding that burden. It's like Atlas holding up the heavens. And if something were to happen to that mountain or that pole, theoretically, then the worlds would collide together and chaos would ensue. Existence as we know it would not continue. It would be something else. And the way I view it, it's like literal chaos, like the atoms splitting apart and the time and space as we know it ending. Well, that's kind of what Baphomet, in fact, has indicated. And that we also talked to Cain about this, too. So the idea is there's these beings trapped in the underworld that have always wanted to come out. They've been trapped there since this event happened that Cain described to us with the Garden of Eden. Since the War of Rebellion, basically, he and all these beings that were loyal to him got trapped in the abyss. And it's like literally jail. And they do deal with us, but they're dealing with us from the underworld. But they really wish that they could be alive. And so that's why they're always trying to possess people, for instance. That's why they want you to do magic rituals to allow them into your body so that they can experience life again through you as the vessel. And they really want this pole to be collapsed because that will let them out. And, yes, there will be chaos, but actually what Cain has described recently is this idea. Okay, I talked about the ark and how the ark, the one box of things, gives you this power, this transcendental power over the whole, existence, I think. And so it seems to me that what he's been describing, how things will play at the end of days, really does kind of match up with what you see in Revelation, because Revelation talks about, Cain had said that he's inside of a box, or he describes a box, this ark box. When they get let out of their prison, I think that they think they're somehow going to be able to take charge of the ark. And, they'll be the pilots of the ark. In other words, they'll be able to control existence or reality. They'll be in the seat of God, basically. And I think that that's what the demons are trying to do. In the book of Revelation, it talks about the New Jerusalem being this cubic city that comes down from heaven and lands on earth and creates a new heaven on earth. And and then what happens is basically all the righteous people are let inside of the cube. And they're the few, the majority of people are not considered worthy to be inside there. And so the chosen few go in, they're given fruit from the tree of life, they're given the water of life from the rivers of life, and they get to live forever. and then everyone else is trapped on the outside of the cube, and they get consumed by the lake of fire. They basically are like, thrown into this chaos that I'm talking about. That's what I imagine is like everything around the cube falls apart into nothingness, really. And so, we all like to think that if we're good enough, that God will reward us by letting us inside the cube. And I think that the demons are ambitious enough that they think they can force their way in and take over that way. So, interestingly enough, after I wrote the book, Clock Shavings, and had these recent sessions with Cain and Baphomet where they were telling me this kind of story, I watched Noah, how do you pronounce his name?
Aronofsky.
Aronofsky.
Yeah.
Yeah, who, you look at all of his films and they're full of Kabbalism and mystical secrets. I mean, this guy is way into Jewish mysticism, obviously. And a
lot of Gnosticism as well.
Yes. And so there's this really interesting part, I think, where in that story, the ark is built as this stationary thing that then gets swept up by the waves. And there's even the scene where Noah is explaining to his family how, all of creation is inside of this box right now, and everything outside is chaos. It's been dissolved into nothingness. But as it turns out, one of the bad guys, one of the descendants of Cain, has snuck on board the ark, and he just stays there waiting the whole time until Noah's son has some conflict issues, personality conflicts with his father. And at that point, this descendant of Cain, Tubal-Cain, he makes friends with Noah's son and convinces him, you really have to kill your father in order to have what you want. His father was in the movie. It's weird. It's like Noah's telling everyone that they have to just, instead of procreating and building a new earth, that they all have to just die. So the son is rebelling against that idea and teams up with Tubal-Cain to kill his own father. And so he helps Tubal-Cain obtain a weapon, and the Tubal-Cain, he basically, kind of ushers his father into the harm's way, where he's besieged all of a sudden by Tubal-Cain. Noah didn't even know this guy was on board the ark, and all of a sudden he comes at him with a knife. I think it was a knife, and attacks him, trying to kill him. And at that moment, Tubal-Cain, he thinks he's about to win over Noah, and he says, as he's about to kill him, "Your women, your beasts, and the ark are all mine." And it's like he's representing the demons in this instance, I think. This is the idea that the descendants of Cain, the demons, can penetrate the ark, the holy ark, and take over that power and become the god, So anyway, I don't even know if Aronofsky really knew what he was doing there, or if that was just one of those things where people get inspired by the same entities that I've been inspired by.
It's possible he may have. Also, the son is Ham, who I believe his great-grandson in the Bible is Nimrod, which would also be... A lot of people say that he was the beginning of another world empire, and that he was the same as Osiris. There's some work that's been done in that. It's Osiris, also Gilgamesh.
Yeah, so I've even heard it claimed that Nimrod is like the first master mason, according to some Masonic traditions.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, I think that, the Cainites really... Even Tubal-Cain itself is like a password in Freemasonry. Definitely, I think that the Freemasons are tapping into this vein of mysticism having to do with the Cainites. And what it is, basically, Freemasonry is all about building. Not just physically building buildings, but also mystically building through magical processes, building reality, creating reality, molding the energies in order to transform the universe around you. I think that they're conducting ritual magic, and I don't think most of them even realize this, but I think that's really what they're doing. And some of them are conscious about it, and some of them are, even right about what they're doing. So I think that that sort of mysticism goes along with the tradition of the Cainites, because the Cainites were really what was said to be bad about them, and not just that their dad, the forefather was a murderer, but also his descendants were the ones that invented metallurgy. They invented the first musical instruments. They invented, they created from the metals that they discovered swords and axes. And it kind of seems like, actually, from the way Genesis describes them, that they were the inventors of, most of what we would consider the arts of civilization in the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's all portrayed as
the Book of Enoch says that they were taught by the fallen angels.
I'm sorry, who was?
The Book of Enoch.
Right. Well, yeah, okay, so the Book of Enoch is really, it turns out these aren't contradictory ideas. The Book of Enoch is kind of just describing the same thing using slightly different terminology. So, the fallen angels in the Book of Enoch really correspond, I think, to the Cainites. And, it's impossible to just merge those two stories together, because then you'll have conflicts with the characters. But, they're telling the same story using different symbolic elements. So, the basic idea is that there are these beings that have taught mankind how to build things and do things. This was the original wisdom we got from them. But the way it's portrayed in the Bible, this was ultimately a negative influence, because, the swords and axes, we were able to kill each other with them. And the musical instruments supposedly had a negative influence by, teaching people to be lewd and lascivious. People would become promiscuous when they heard the music that the daughters of Cain would play on their instruments. And they taught, they all practiced magic, supposedly. They knew how to use the influence of the stars and the how to mix different herbs and things like that to create magical potions. And so, it was considered that the knowledge that the Cainites have is negative, just because, once you have this knowledge, you're able to do things both good and bad. So, right. I think the Freemasons are kind of continuing that tradition. They have access to wisdom that can be considered dangerous. And that's really why that's really why all secret societies keep a lot of their wisdom secret, is because in the wrong hands, it's dangerous. And also it's dangerous for anyone else to know that they have it, because they'll, immediately be a target. So, I think that the Freemasonry, I guess, long story short, it makes sense to me that Freemasonry is actually continuing sort of the traditions of the Cainites.
In the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about, you have a theory about Rennes-le-Château and that area in France. And some people have said that, that's where Jesus is buried. There's been a whole lot of other theories, but your theory is, and I think it fits in great with what you've talked about with Cain being in a box and he's communicating with everybody, is that you believe that it's possibly Cain that is actually buried in that area.
Yeah, well, the story that Cain told us is that, all right, Henry Lincoln, one of those authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, what he spent the last, 2 decades really writing about was just this one seemingly tiny aspect of the whole mystery, which is that when you look at a map of the area, there's these 5 mountains that surround the village that are actually sort of equidistant to each other, or their peaks are. And when you draw lines connecting them, it forms this perfect pentagram. And it's kind of amazing. There's really not anything like it on the rest of the surface of the planet. And so, Henry Lincoln was just theorizing, well, it's this amazing coincidence, and so that's why this is this center of mystery in the area. That's why there's so many people who find it to be a mystical place, is that there's just this amazing natural phenomenon there. Well, so I theorized, and then, after asking Cain, found it, he was at least willing to back it up, that maybe these aren't natural mountains, and maybe the reason why they're able to be so perfectly aligned with each other is because there's actually something that was, artificially built underneath them. And which is not, again, unheard of in archaeology. A lot of times, they'll find something, a hill or a patch of dirt that looks a little bit odd, and they dig, and sure enough, they find a pyramid or some kind of ancient temple under there. So,
Right.
again, I'm no geologist. I don't know, if my theory has already been disproven or what, but it was just an idea I had. So I asked Cain, and sure enough, he says that yes, there's a vast temple underneath Rennes-le-Chateau. These 5 peaks are like the 5, maybe pyramids or ziggurats that the whole form the whole complex. He says underneath it, there's a gigantic necropolis of, important personages going all the way back to Cain himself and some of the other characters in those stories in the Bible. So, that may very well be the physical location he was speaking to us from, he said he's in the center of the earth. Maybe there's an entrance from one of those mountains that actually goes all the way down there. And when we asked him who had built this thing, he said Dagon, Dagon, which was a fish god worshipped by the Philistines. It's mentioned in the Bible, and to me, that corresponds basically with the idea of the Kinatar, because we talked about
Right.
the sea creature that spawned the Merovingians, supposedly. Well, kin, Latinized, would indicate the number 5. So you could think of it as like a 5-horned creature. And maybe that is somehow reflected by the fact that there's these 5 peaks and this, what may be an actual temple complex built supposedly by Dagon. So, yeah, Dagon, I presume, is some kind of ancient creature or personage. And I still haven't, decided whether these beings, when they were physically present on Earth, were they human or did they resemble humans? Were they giants like the Bible says? I don't know. But if something is able to build a temple complex that looks, like a set of 5 mountains, I would say whoever built that, has pretty fantastic powers. So, whether it's a magician with the ability to mold matter in some sort of fantastic way, I suppose that's possible. Or maybe that creature is just so big that they can move things around like that. So maybe when we're talking about giants, maybe they're really big giants. I don't know.
Yeah, there is a whole thing right now, especially kind of like as I mentioned before with the fringe Christian groups, that a lot of people talk about Nephilim, and that's like a big thing.
Yes.
In some Christian circles. I'm sure you're aware of it.
Oh yeah. Well, the reason why you mentioned at the beginning how you tried to get me on the air or on your show before. And I just told you, gosh, I'm too busy now. And the reason why I'm busy is because I'm producing the show with Clyde Lewis now called Ground Zero. It's this radio show that's national. And, man, that takes up a lot of my time because we're doing 5 hours of radio every night. And,
I can imagine, yeah.
And so, but I brought it up because, like, every time we talk about aliens, basically all of our phone lines, and we have 6 of them, will be flooded with Christians who just want to tell us that, by the way, the aliens are all demons. And, and then they want to talk about Genesis 6. And, I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong. Certainly every contact I have had seems to point to that possibility. But still, it's maybe kind of a simplistic way of interpreting it. I think that everything that I've experienced just tells me that this universe that we're in is so complicated and so big, and even what we can see with our telescopes is just a tiny part of it, but luckily we do have other senses besides the 5, and so that is really the only way that we can obtain any information, if you want to call it information. That's the only way we can get any kind of contact about what's beyond. So That's why I feel like even though it's an imperfect science, or it's not a science at all, really, it's still useful because I've gotten what I get is inspiration and clues in my research from doing this, and it just shows me a different way of looking at things, and then gives me ideas about where to go with my research. And so, yeah, like I said, I don't always take what the spirits tell me at face value, and I don't always agree with them, but sometimes I get useful information that way. So I think it's a kind of a cool research tool, and I'll probably still use it in the future.
Well, some of the things that we have talked about, fit very well in that camp of just the Baphomet and Cain and these different aspects that are very similar to some of the stuff that people will talk about in those Christian fields.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't necessarily think they're wrong. It's just I think that everyone has a narrow perspective. No one's really looking at the big picture. So a thing too is like, is there really a separation between the idea of an alien and a demon? I don't necessarily think so, because I think once you're willing to entertain the idea of something being extraterrestrial, then you've got to accept that it's beyond you. So, and is there any reason why someone or something that happens to be located on the other side of the galaxy can't actually communicate with you? And maybe if they communicated with you, they would seem really big, or maybe they would. You wouldn't be able to physically see them, but maybe they could still influence your reality somehow. In other words, I think that there's ways. Well, I know we're running out of time. Basically, I'm saying that I don't think those two things are separate at all, and I think you could have a spiritual experience contacting an alien. I think that an alien could influence reality magically. I think that the idea of time and space even is sort of illusory. So we think that if we find a planet that's light years away and has something on it living, that doesn't mean we can't contact it or that we're not influencing each other already. Anyway, I think I'm just saying, I think these things are so complicated, and that's why I'll probably just keep looking into it, because I'll never get bored. There'll always be more stuff to research.
Since I've started doing this show, I can tell you the different people that I've had on from many different viewpoints and from many different beliefs and many different points of view, that it seems that sometimes that there are labels that are put on different phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it could all be the same thing. It's just that as humans, we like to put things in categories. This is a UFO phenomenon. This is a ghost phenomenon. This is a spirit communication phenomenon, mm-hmm. or a Bigfoot phenomenon, or cryptozoology. But in reality, it could be all the same phenomenon, and we just look at it in our narrow point of view because we want to categorize it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what's going on. Exactly.
Well, Tracy, just real quick before we go, tell everybody where they can contact you, and also where everybody can get your books.
Well, you can contact me and find tons of free articles and other information by going to tracyrtwyman.com or tracytwyman.com. And that's TracyTwyman. And even if you forget how to spell it, you can probably sort of fake it, and Google will correct you. And
right.
My books are all on Amazon.